I'll wait for a few messages to come in just to make sure we're connecting here. Let me know if you can hear me. Let me know where you're tuning in from. In the meantime, let's get the questions ready here. All right. Great. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Geetha, Ruth, Ariel, Satish. Fantastic. All right. Thanks for joining. This is episode 4 of Is This a Dream? Right? This is the book that we're following now. And we've made it through the introduction and into chapter 1. And we'll finish up chapter 1 today and maybe start chapter 2 as well. Hi, Vardhini, Monica, Graham. Good to see you all. All right. So as usual, let's start with a pause. All the events of the day are coming to a pause here. And we as a group are coming together to investigate and explore a more complete picture of what's happening right now. What is happening right now? Consciousness, a fundamental, undifferentiated consciousness that is not restricted to a body, that is not restricted to a personal mind, that is not restricted to a brain or a head, not restricted to a lifetime, not restricted to a dimension. This fundamental consciousness that really has no word for what it is expressing as though this field of space and time. Right? Hence the title, Is This a Dream? Because is that not what happens in a dream? The fundamental consciousness. In the dream, we would call it a mind. From this waking state, that which is fundamental is expressing as space and time. And there's something impeccably beautiful about that. That no words can really capture. So welcome. Thanks for joining. Let's look at these questions. Many questions were asked last week. So the first one is a very practical one. How do we deal with fear? And regardless of what problem we're trying to solve, regardless of what challenge we are trying to solve, in this case it's fear, right? Another question was, what about grieving? How do we deal with grieving or suffering? So whatever the challenge is that we're trying to solve, the essential aspect, the essential steps of the solution are the same. Whatever the problem is, right? And that's the whole approach of the three minds framework, is that it is the shift in identity that happens in moving from the first mind to the second mind. It is that shift that in a way is a solution. Not that it solves all problems, and not that all problems magically disappear, but rather that shift provides the resources, provides the recognition of what is going on, of what is happening. What is the complete picture of what is actually happening? and allows the resources that are needed to resolve that to flow in, to be accessed, to be recognized, to be utilized. Okay, so this is the fundamental underlying framework. Now, in this particular context, for example, how do we deal with fear? What does this process look like of shifting from the first to the second mind? It always involves steadying the mind to a certain extent. And this is why all traditions talk about some form of meditation, some form of meditation, some form of introspection. Now, meditation, when I'm feeling very scared and the mind is jumping around, then meditation is not really possible, right? You'll notice that the mind does not want to sit in meditation, especially if there are things that we are avoiding, right? If that restlessness is there in the mind, then the last thing it wants to do is sit, because it's almost like an earthquake for the first mind. It has to feel all that jostling, all that restlessness, all that irritation, and it doesn't want to. So it'll start to make excuses. I can't do this. I don't have time for this. Many reasons will come up, right? So to even come to that stage where the body can be still, where the first mind can be still, or at least the contents of that can be decreased, there has to be an initial stage, especially if the fear is high. And this is why in Vedanta, what's recommended is called karma yoga. Karma yoga is essentially doing actions with the body in a mindful way, right? Why? What's the theory behind that? The theory is that because there's so much restless energy, right? In this case, it's taking the form of fear. Because there's so much restless energy, the mind itself can't handle it. The first mind. Why? Because the first mind is bounded. It has very little real estate to accommodate all of these thoughts, all of these questions, all of these doubts. It starts getting shaken. So to express that through the body, to release that energy, is karma yoga, right? Doing work in a mindful way, meaning being aware of the work as we do it, right? This can happen with sports too. Even sports can be played with the spirit of karma yoga, right? It's the action of the body, but we are mindful as we are doing it of the action, right? And that way, it's a way to release the excess energy that's built up. And if that release is not there, then sitting down for meditation can be very difficult, right? So that depends on the nature of the mind. Each person has to decide for themselves, right? Each person has to decide for themselves, where is my mind now, right? Even in this first mind configuration, where is this mind? What can it handle? What does it need, right? What is the prescription for this mind? Is it activity, physical activity? For some people, throughout the life, there will be lots of physical activity. Everybody has their own nature, right? Doing the physical activity with a perspective of mindfulness that releases some of that agitation, right? And then the mind is then, because of that, it reaches a particular level of calmness. It doesn't have to be entirely calm, but at least calmer for the next step. What is the next step? The next step may be journaling, right? Now that I'm at least still enough that I can sit in one place, now I might want to journal, right? This happened. When this happens, I know it happens like this. This is really frustrating. This happens in this way. It's further giving expression to that mind. And at some point through these activities, the mind reaches, that first mind reaches a point of enough calm that now it's able to sit within itself. And then keep still and notice its own sense of identity. Notice the boundaries of itself, right? And this is the threshold of the second mind. Let's pause here. So we're talking about how do we deal with fear? And fear is no different than anything else. Fear is ultimately the fear of the loss of the boundary of the first mind. So when a person gets into what's called spirituality, right? We call spirituality a particular quest for something, for discovering our identity, right? But it's not a separate field. It's not separate from any other aspect of life, right? It's not an ITY, an itty like anything else. It is simply wanting to know what's going on. What is my nature? What am I? What is this world? What's happening here? What are these relationships? What is time? What happens before? What happens after? These are simply incredibly practical and relevant questions that change the way we experience ourselves and experience the world and experience life. So when a person starts on this, the entire journey is about recognizing and going beyond this sense of boundary. Though it's not often put in those words, that is the exact, precise nature of what's happening. Recognizing and going beyond that sense of boundary. This is what it means to think outside the box. Why does everybody say, if you go to any leadership, or if you have to sit in one of those meetings, those dreaded meetings, droning on and on, they might say, think outside the box. What does that mean? It means there's a limitation in the thinking beyond which the mind doesn't see what is possible or what can be done. Right? What is that limitation? Again, it's the limitation of the first mind that binds the mind in that particular state. So dealing with fear is fundamentally not different than anything else. It is about the fear of losing that boundary. Though in the beginning, in starting on what's called a spiritual path, a person might actually feel like, I want to lose that boundary. I want to lose that boundary. However, the I that wants to lose the boundary is the boundary itself. It's the first mind. And so it can be scary, right? This is the original fear on which all other fears are built. Even the fear of death is the fear of the loss of this boundary, the loss of this security that makes me what I am. So the steps are preparing the mind to reach a particular level of calmness. Not totally calm, but calm enough to be able to really sit and notice itself. So express through the body whatever excess energy is there. Express it mindfully. Be aware of why we're doing it and let it express, right? It's almost like squeezing a soaked towel, squeezing the towel dry. Similarly, the system is squeezing all the excess energy out. All the excess energy is dripping out. It's flowing out, right? And then when you shake that towel, it's damp, but it's no longer soaked with energy. It's still damp. So similarly, that mind that was soaking with that excess energy, it's been squeezed out through this activity. And now the mind is still damp with energy, but it's enough that it can be managed now through introspection and meditation ultimately. All right, so dealing with fear is still ultimately this process of shifting identity from the first to the second mind. Let's pause here. And in these pauses, the meaning of the words, not the intellectual meaning, but the indication of these words come to life. And then as we start speaking again, as we're doing now, keep that which is indicated, that which is recognized, keep that as a primary focus of attention, as the primary source of attention. because this is what it's all about, not the words. And then somebody said, what about grieving? Or what about suffering? Similar, right? Essentially the same response. Now, grieving is when I was attached to a particular thing and that thing has been taken away. Now I grieve for it, right? Because this boundary of the first mind wanted that, right? It became dependent on that. It kind of grabs something and makes it a part of this boundary. It reinforces the boundary, right? So if I have a really nice car that I just bought, it's really expensive, it's really fancy, and when everybody sees it, everybody says, wow, that's a really nice car. Now, that car now, the first mind grabs it and kind of puts it into the boundary. That idea of ownership of the car gets caked into the boundary, and now the boundary is even stronger. And now you'll see when that car gets a dent, the person themselves feel like they got dented, right? The person gets hurt when the car gets hurt, literally. You'll see that the car gets dented, the person will get inflamed and angry, like they've sustained a wound, because they have, because that mind, the boundary of the mind, has been imbued with that ownership of the car, right? So grieving comes when this mind was attached to something and that's taken away, then that feeling of loss is grieving, right? I'm just describing the mechanism. It's not right or wrong, good or bad. This is the mechanism of what happens with grieving. Now, one thing to recognize in some cases of grieving, especially if we're talking about grieving because of death, let's say somebody that I knew died, right? Now, where does the grieving come from? It can come from two places. Really, it's from missing the presence of that person, right? So something that was there is gone. That's one thing. And the other thing is imagining that that person is no longer there, that somehow magically this person disappeared, right? Which is not the case. In death, the body is left behind. The function of the body has been completed. The usefulness of the body is over, right? So in that case, would we not want that person to leave? Right? Suppose I have an old car, all four tires are flat, the engine barely turns on, the windshield is cracked, and there's no steering wheel. Now, would I want somebody I love to stay in that car? Say, no, you got to stay in that car because that's the only way I recognize you. Right? It's a kind of torture. They may have to move on to the next car. So recognizing the nature of what's happening is also important here, right? Death is not necessarily a loss of someone. It's more like a graduation, right? When the person leaves sixth grade and goes to high school, or leaves high school and goes to college, we're not grieving because we know there's a next stage. And unfortunately, in this society, when we start talking about life and death, it all gets bunched up into either religion or spirituality or some of these kinds of labels, instead of just saying that these are the most practical things in the world that every human being experiences. So let us investigate them directly. So grieving, the fundamental process in terms of dealing with it is the same, is that shift, right? And if grieving is happening, that's it's a typical aspect of this society. It takes its time, right? There's no need, we don't have to get over it quickly. No, that's what happens in the society. So it takes its time, it takes its course, right? And at the same time, if we can have a deeper vision for what is happening in the case of death, then that process will be much easier because it's not necessarily a loss. It's simply a shift in the way we are living. Okay, what is the dark night of the soul? What is a dark night of the soul? I'm trying to see how many of these questions we should get through. So the dark night of the soul is typically this transition period as the configuration is shifting out of the first mind. Right? The major psychological beliefs, the psychological tendencies that have to be worn through, that have to be seen through, right? Their clutch on the identity and the breaking of that clutch and the disillusionment is the dark night of the soul, right? It's really the dark night of the first mind. That first mind which feels that it's losing its grip on what it thought it was. It's losing its grip on the rules of the world, the rules that say, if I follow these rules, then I will be happy, right? And yet, either that mind can't follow the rules for whatever reason, or it's following the rules and it's not working. Either way, there's something that's not working. And that resulting process of disillusionment is what's called the dark night of the soul. And here, disillusionment is one of the best things that can happen to a person. Right? Who wants to be in illusion? Disillusionment is clarity. Somehow in this society, disillusionment became a bad thing. Oh, he's disillusioned, or she's disillusioned. They're going through a hard time. Oh, she's disillusioned. Great. That means she's starting to see clearly. The rest of the people, they want to remain in the illusion, the comfort of illusion, the apparent comfort of illusion. Of what? Illusion of the nature of things, the nature of the world, the nature of oneself. So the dark night of soul is that transition process as the first mind is losing its bearings. All the things that were working or that were supposed to work according to the stories that we were told are no longer working. How do we access and get information from the subconscious? We're always getting information from the subconscious. Our actions are largely driven by the subconscious, and only subsequently are they rationalized with thoughts, right? We do things because we feel like we have to. Something is driving us, and then we go back and tell a story about it. So we always have access, and we're always getting information from the subconscious. I think the intention here behind this question is, how do we open that up more, right? How does that come through more? And this essentially is the question, how do we shift to the second mind? Right? So the process is the same. Decreasing the content in the mind to begin with. The mind is like the windshield through which we experience the world. So if the windshield is clogged with many thoughts, many beliefs, many ideas, many stories, then we don't see as clearly. The information doesn't stream in as much, right? So by clearing that, by decreasing the number of thoughts, then that windshield is more clear. And then that deeper intelligence, that intuition, what we call intuition and insight, streams in. Why? Because there's less activity and content in the mind blocking that vision. Somebody said, becoming more productive since listening to these sessions. Yes, so what's happening in these sessions as we talk, ideally, the idea is that the doubts and the questions can get answered and cleared out of the way. right? That windshield, that screen that we're talking about, can get cleared. Let's say a question was there for months or for years, some deep question, and it starts getting cleared. Then to the extent, it's like pulling a weed, to the extent that's taken out, that much more clarity is there. And what happens is the number of thoughts that a person needs to function are relatively few, right? In this society, we often stress thought and thinking as the way to understanding. Thought is helpful, but in fact, it's secondary, right? Thought is a particular derived form of that deeper consciousness. And it's not necessary to navigate most of the day. It's only necessary for certain processes. And so when we talk about being productive, if we decrease, as these number of thoughts get decreased, we'll see that there are just a few real core ideas that are needed to relate to the world. Because that's what we're talking about. We still want to relate in some way to the world. And there, some kind of idea structure, some kind of thought form is needed. And there are actually very few that are needed. So those get aligned. The excess thoughts that aren't really doing much, that aren't really actionable, they can get dropped. A few thoughts that are there, they can then be aligned into a way that's useful, that has some function in the society, right? So that's one thing that is happening. The other thing is when we get together like this, almost everyone that's here has the same intention of exploring this deeper awareness. So when you have thousands of people together exploring with that intention, there is a settling that can happen in the mind. All right, so that first step that we talked about, which is decreasing the content, decreasing all the activity, that can spontaneously happen. And so with decreased content, with alignment of a few thoughts that are helpful as functions in society, and with the overall settling of the mind, now that mind naturally becomes more potent. It becomes more productive if it wants to be. Let's take a pause here, and then we'll get into, we have 4 more questions that are a little bit deeper. So the next question is, how does one negotiate karma through meditation without losing oneself? How does one negotiate karma through meditation without losing oneself? So karma, meditation, and losing oneself is the idea. Negotiating karma. So negotiating karma, what does this mean, to negotiate karma? It means to function in such a way that karma loses its hold, right? The excess karma loses its hold on us, right? So karma are that force, those actions that have now created this situation in our life, whatever it has been, whatever the actions have been, that have now created this present situation, right? Our karmas are manifesting. Now, how do we negotiate that? So to negotiate that means to go beyond this sense of identity, that I am the one who is doing this. I, this first mind, is the one that I'm doing this. I, this first mind, is the one that succeeded. I, this first mind, is the one that failed. It is this perspective of I as the first mind that continuously creates the karma, right? Because it doesn't matter if the I is successful or unsuccessful, the results always go back to that I, because the sense is there. The I is like a magnet. I did this and I did that and I didn't do this. I failed here. And all of these statements and all of these actions and all of these expressions in the world get attributed to and stuck to that first mind. So this is, in a way, not negotiating the karma, meaning not navigating it gracefully. Navigating it gracefully is acting, but the sense of identity is not localized with that particular character, with the first mind, right? With that particular body and with that particular mind. The sense of identity is not restricted to that. And so it's not accumulating all of these results, all of these tendencies. It's merely releasing all of the things that have built up so far. Right? Because why? Because the I, that individual I, that first mind I, is not the I that is acting anymore. It is that second mind, that what we say consciousness, or that awareness, which is expressing as that particular body and as that particular mind, which is extinguishing or releasing or expressing all the karmas that have been brought up so far, that have to be expressed. So in this way, negotiating karma means operating from a different level of identity. Now, the question is how to do that without losing oneself. And in a way, that's not possible. Right? It depends what we mean by losing oneself. Losing that first mind configuration is part of negotiating it gracefully. It's not possible to say it's me and I'm going to do it and I'm going to navigate this karma. No, that just becomes another activity, another sense of I that's aggregated. Right? This is a subtle question. Negotiate karma without losing oneself. Technically, not possible if we're talking about losing the first mind. The first mind, in a way, is lost. That configuration has to undo itself, and that is when karma is negotiated. And there's also another part, through meditation, and we talked about that earlier. Meditation is one of the means by which this identity can shift. So let's put all the three together. How do we negotiate karma through meditation without losing oneself? Negotiating karma gracefully means losing oneself, meaning losing that sense of strict individuality of the first mind through the process of meditation. I see Anna asked a question here. I'm going to answer this one right now. She says, hello, Anoop. I was wondering how you're able to balance the framework science that your profession requires you to go by versus the higher consciousness and spirituality. I sometimes struggle with this, being a nurse practitioner. So there's no contradiction between science and what we're talking about here, Anna. Let's pause here. Anna, there's no contradiction between science, between what you learned in school and what we're talking about here. The science that we learned, that you and I learned, that everyone learned, including the science of medicine, is based upon our perceptions of the world and the body. In medicine, we define a human being as a human body, right? When you and I studied anatomy, we didn't study the anatomy of the human being, we studied the anatomy of the human body. And there's a big difference between the human being and the human body. The human body is one aspect of the human being, right? But we don't talk about that. When we learn anatomy, we assume it's the anatomy of the person. But the person is so much more than the body, right? When we learn physiology, we learn the physiology of the physical system. We don't learn the physiology of the mind. We don't learn the physiology of the energetic body. We don't learn the physiology of the deeper second mind. right? So the anatomy and physiology taught in medical school is a fraction of the anatomy and physiology of the human being, right? It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's dramatically incomplete. So based upon what we perceive, what that first mind perceives of the human being, it is that perception which is codified as science and the principles of medicine. Right? So if I see the human being as a collection of organs, which is how medical science sees it. Now, as clinicians, we see people as people, but the science that we learn, this is an important point, the science we learn reduces the human being to a body, to a physicalized thing, even though as human beings, we see people as people. So the science we learn doesn't match our experience, right? And this is why rapport is talked about so much in healthcare, because rapport is this one word that somehow symbolizes all of what we don't know. And so building rapport with the patient becomes so important because there's so much we don't know. There's so much that's not codified in science. So based on what the first mind sees, Anna, of the person, that is codified as the anatomy of that person. That fraction of the human being becomes the patient seen through the lens of medical science. And then all the principles are according to that version of the person. And so they become dramatically incomplete. It doesn't mean that they're not effective in their own way. They certainly are, right? It simply means that they're incomplete. So there's no fundamental contradiction between what I'm saying and what we learn in medical school. The only thing is, what we're talking about is a much broader view of the human being than what medical science understands. So how does this affect clinical practice? Well, when we go in and we see patients, what we bring is our entire understanding as a human being, right? The treatments, the diagnostic algorithms, and the treatments that are prescribed according to the level of science, because that's what's defined as the standard of care. So there's a difference between who I am and how I relate to a person clinically and what the specific diagnostic algorithm and treatment algorithm is. Many times the treatment is simply being with a person and hearing them. That itself has a tremendous healing effect. All right, let's take a pause here. And for anyone who's interested, Anna, you may be interested. I think if you go to the website, anoopkumar.com, there's probably a link for courses, and then there's a course there called Second Mind Medicine. And Second Mind Medicine, at some point, perhaps we'll start this as a series. It's basically an exposition of the nature of medicine and healthcare right now, and what the limitations are, and what has to be done to see it in a more complete way and to shift to a new vision of healthcare. All right. So the next question is, can compassion and detachment be part of the same mind? And the short answer is yes. Compassion and detachment can be part of the same mind, especially as that mind shifts to the second mind. Now, the idea is that detachment, we talked about this last week, that detachment means I am somehow unattached from what is happening or not perceiving what's happening. And this is not the case. The detachment is from the particularity, from the vision of just a thing as a thing, right? The detachment from that restricted vision of what the world is detachment, right? Or it's not detaching from the world in its entirety. It's detaching from this particular vision of what the world is. The essential nature of the world is consciousness, is the premise here. This is the hypothesis that we are investigating. The essential nature of the world is consciousness. So seeing consciousness as the world is part of the process. We don't have to detach from the world in that sense. It's detaching from the idea that this world is made up of this thing plus this thing plus this thing plus this person and this idea, and if we just put them all together, we have a world. No. The world is created from the inside out, so to speak. And that vision, to recognize that, sometimes we say detach from this particular kind of vision, from this narrow vision, and recognize your own nature. And in there, from that kind of detachment, compassion can be part of it, right? Compassion comes from with experience. Calm means with, and passion is like a type of experiencing. Like with the experience is what it literally means. So can we be with the experience of another person? This is compassion. It doesn't always mean that the person feels that we are being nice. Right? Compassion is not always about the other person feeling that we are nice. Right? It's also not about being withdrawn. The way it looks in any particular context will be different. It depends on so many factors. But if we can recognize and experience what that person is feeling and respond with consideration for that, this is compassion. And this is facilitated by this kind of detachment that I was speaking about. Because otherwise, it's not actually compassion, because we ourselves can get overwhelmed or drawn into that to such an extent that we're not actually clear on what is happening. So certainly this is possible, compassion and detachment. Bring the attention to the forefront. We're talking about a lot of different things. Why are we disconnected from our real nature in the first place? Why are we disconnected from our real nature in the first place? So we are not disconnected from our real nature in the first place. Would we say that wind is disconnected from air? No, wind is not disconnected from air. There is no wind if there's no air. And wind is nothing but air in the state of action. Right? So similarly, we being disconnected, this is the first mind that's disconnected, right? Because of the boundary, it's not recognizing what it already is. It's not that the first mind has to become and develop into the second mind, the third mind. Its essential nature is consciousness. The essential nature of this right now is consciousness. Whether it's recognized or not depends on the thickness of that boundary. So it's not that we're disconnected in the first place. It's that there can be an experience of disconnection. That's certainly true. The first mind experiences itself as though disconnected from the real nature. Right? So why? Why is it then experienced? Because that attention is more on the boundary than it is the entire field. See, think about it this way. You have a vast field, right? 1 million acres of open grassland. And in the middle of this field, we've constructed a shed. 4 walls. Let's say it's 4 feet by 4 feet. We put up a shed, and there's no foundation, there's no floor, it's just 4 walls stuck into the grass. In this middle of this 1 million acre grassland, right? And now standing inside that, somebody says, how do I get to the field? How do I get to this 1 million acre grassland? Well, of course, what they don't recognize is that they are on the field. They are in the middle of 1,000,000 wide open acres. It's not recognized. Why? Because the attention is on the boundary. The attention is on the walls, right? That attention that has been held fixed by so many stories, you're in a shed, you're in a shed, you're in a shed, has not been relaxed beyond that boundary. And so the vision and the experience is limited to that of the shed and not of the field. Now, how far does this person have to go to experience the field? Somebody might say, you're so close, it's just 2 steps away, right? Walk 2 steps, open the door, and you'll be out in the field. But in fact, a more precise answer is, you don't have to move. You are in the middle of the field. Simply look beyond this boundary, or knock down the boundary. You are already in the field. Right? So similarly, we are not disconnected from our real nature in the first place. It seems like that in the first mind because the attention has been restricted to within the walls of the boundary. And for the most part, nobody has really told us that all of this attention is happening within a small circumference. And there's actually much more vision and much more of what is happening beyond the boundary of this first mind. Right? From the perspective of consciousness itself, there's no limitation. Consciousness in its native nature is not experiencing the first mind. It's not experiencing limitation. It is that because of its infinite potentiality, that first mind creates its own experience as though separate from consciousness. Fundamentally, consciousness is unrestricted. Because of its infinite nature, as potential, as creativity, all of these forms can arise, and these forms get lost within themselves. So this is the reason why there can be the experience of being disconnected, even though fundamentally there is no disconnection. Right? So it's a shift in attention, a shift in awareness. Wow, 10 minutes left. I think we should answer this last question. There's one more question here. I think we should answer it because it's an insightful one. The answer is insightful and challenging. Is the second or third mind sustainable? Right? Now the question is, sustainable by who or sustainable by what? See, what we're talking about as the first mind or the second mind or the third mind is the very sense of identity. Let's pause here. This second mind, this third mind, this first mind, they are different configurations of identity. So consciousness as itself, unconfigured, undifferentiated, is this third mind. Right? As though with a border is the first mind. And the second mind is beyond the border, but still having some boundary, being able to function in the world. So is it sustainable? Is a configuration sustainable? Yes. It is just not a person that is going to sustain it. Right? It is not that I, the person that wants to attain some second mind, is going to attain the second mind and sustain it. No. That's a first mind idea. It's the first mind that wants to attain something to add, make its boundary bigger, make its boundary stronger. Right? So it's not a person or a sense of individuality. It is not the first mind that acquires the second mind and then sustains it, holds on to it tightly. No. Rather, the shift in configuration itself, it's self-sustaining, right? There's always some flux depending on how that mind is acting, right? If the choice or the desires or the karmas are to function in particular fields in society, then more of those boundaries will be needed to be able to function, right? On the other hand, there are some that we don't even know about that are not part of society, that would not be following any societal rules. They have released more of the boundaries. So the amount of flux that each configuration experiences will depend on how it's functioning. All right? So it's not a rigid state. 1, jump, 2, jump, 3. No, there's a flux. But that range over which it's fluxing will vary depending on how that mind is engaging and what world it is engaging in. What do I mean, what world? Remember, we said that the world appears differently in each of these configurations. It is not that there is some objective world out there and then the mind is deciding how to. No. As the mind is, so the world is perceived. So depending on the nature of that particular mind and how it engages and what world it perceives, the range of 1, 2, 3, where it functions, will differ. Right? Is it functioning more or less in the world of form? Then that will differ. The freedom is the freedom in recognizing the nature of the world, the nature of identity, and the nature of what is happening, and the relaxation and the ease that flows into the body and the personality as a result of seeing things as they are. That is the freedom. It's not that it's freedom from having to do anything. Right? The problem is not in doing something or not doing something. The problem is feeling like one is caught in the action or restricted by the action or commanded by the action to do something. That is where the karma is. The karma is not in the body playing out its roles. So is the second or third mind sustainable? It is sustainable. It is just not a person who is sustaining it. The configuration in and of itself is sustained within a particular range based on how it's expressing. So this Katie says, the only boundaries there are the ones we create ourselves. Yes. It doesn't mean that we as individuals are, but this mind and the configuration itself is what lends that vision of boundary. So 5 minutes left. Is this a dream? The good thing is, all of this still works in the context of the book because it's all asking this question. Let's finish off chapter 1. So at the bottom of page 12, the detective says to Maggie, "You don't have to remember," he explained. He's talking to Maggie. "You don't have to remember. You just have to see that your personality, what you call Maggie, is an overlay on top of what you are, what you have always been." Which makes sense, right? What is this overlay? This first mind, right? The individual personality, the individual body is an overlay or a modification of the underlying fundamental consciousness. And then it says that Maggie wanted to ridicule his strange theory. It was preposterous. She wanted to stay angry and prove the detective wrong. Right? So that's that boundary of the first mind flaring up. right? How dare you challenge my identity? What do you know about who I am? Right? These ideas will start to flare up because the first mind wants to defend itself. It feels an existential threat correctly. It correctly feels an existential threat to its idea of what it is. And so it's common for people to fight, get angry, demonstrative at this stage. The detective continued, Maggie arrives every time you wake up in the morning, and she leaves when you go to sleep. What does this mean? Maggie arrives every time you wake up in the morning, and she leaves when you go to sleep. Well, when you wake up, when we say you wake up in the morning, what is it that wakes up? It is the mind, right? The body wasn't sleeping. The body was doing all kinds of things at night, right? Repairing tissue, the immune system's functioning, memories are consolidating. So much is happening in the body at night. The body doesn't sleep. It's that projecting mind which sleeps. So when the body is sleeping, where is Maggie? Or when the mind is sleeping, rather, where is Maggie? Maggie arrives when the first mind wakes up. Right? The first mind feels that sense of particularity and projects that onto the world. And when she sleeps, Maggie goes away. The personality goes away. It may reappear in a different form in another dimension, which we call dream, another space-time dimension, again projected by the mind. So when we wake up, it literally means we as a personality come into being in that moment, right? Not the body. The body continues. The body never sleeps. The only time the body sleeps, when it sleeps, we call it death, right? So the body stays awake for decades. The mind stays awake for, 16 hours or so. So in the morning, the first mind wakes up, the personality arrives. When they go to sleep, personality goes away. Dream starts, the personality shows up again, right? Personality travels wherever it has to travel, has its experiences. Then if it goes back to sleep, it disappears. Wakes up, personality appears. Now this personality is what most of the world refers to as I. And yet now we know through our explorations that it is just the tip of the iceberg of what I is. Is this a dream? So starting Friday, there's going to be a membership service on this, on Deepak's channels, where this will still be available, but there will be another class in which Deepak will be giving a lesson, I will be giving a lesson, and there will be yoga lessons as well. So that'll be a separate membership. We will continue, as always, on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern or 3 p.m. Pacific. And there will also be this additional membership where there will be extra lessons. I'm planning on taking a series called Gems from Ancient India, where we'll be looking at some ancient texts and interpreting them in the context of not only our personal life, but how they apply to healthcare, to education, to the sectors in our society. What is the transformative link between these texts that are thousands of years old that many people might find are not relevant? What is the direct link between them and what we're experiencing in terms of our own awareness, but also how they apply to transforming these sectors? Gems of Ancient India. This is just a thought that's flying around. We'll see. But this may be the series that I take up in that membership. Along with, there'll be some yoga teachers, and Deepak also will be teaching. So if you're interested, look for that starting Friday. And either way, I will see you here next Wednesday. Submit your questions, please. Write down all the questions you have, and we will get to them next week.